Welcome to this video on Mercia Eliade's Cosmos and History, the myth of the eternal return. This is just basically just a my thoughts on the book. Now, if you haven't heard of Mercia Eliade, then you can always search Google and search the book Cosmos and History. But the fact that you're watching this video would tell me that you already know Mercia Eliade and you have already read maybe parts of the book Cosmos and History. It's not necessarily a complicated book. But anyway, let's see if I can help in the way of interpretation of what was or what is being said in the book. This is the title of this video is Repetition in Cyclical Time, and that is more or less the basic concepts in Eliade's book Cosmos and History. Now, important in Eliade's Cosmos and History is, of course, the idea of archetypes. Archetypes are viewed as some sort of grand events that happened in the past. The creation of the world, the creation of the universe, the primal act of sin, for example, a great flood, a kind of famine, all these events that occurred and that somehow changed the way a society and a community works. And it's kind of like a symbolism of the center, in which at the very center lies the symbolic plane of existence itself. A mountain for a city, or a city for a mountain. A river is not just a river. A river can be interpreted with something else. A huge tree is not just a tree, but a tree of life. There is in that a kind of transcending the material realm and going towards a more meaningful celestial plane of the archetypes. And what do we mean by symbolism of the center? There's always an imagined center in every culture, and we're always drawn towards that center. And what we get here is almost kind of like a structure in which little communities surrounding the center is actually given meaning by the center itself. And that sort of defines the function of archetypes. Archetypes give even profane existence, profane activities, as Eliade would say, specific meanings. Meanings that transcend everyday life. And Eliade, for example, will compare death. Death for historical modern man that would be the end of it. Because history for modern man the meaning we get out of history is subjective. History may or may not have meaning at all. When we live through life, when we look at the past, we may find meaning there, and we may not find meaning. So it's kind of like very subjective. And what it does is the past, therefore, is treated like objective reality, is treated like an object. For archaic man, traditional man, the past is already imbued with meanings. Trees, as I've said, trees, mountains, rivers, all of these are not just features in geography, but these are features of culture, in a way of putting it. In terms of death, the reason why I place Zizek here is that there's something very common with the idea of traditional man and Zizek's notion of two deaths. Now, for traditional man, according to Eliade, when you die, you don't just suffer death, or say you don't just die. You are transcended into the planes of the archetypes. You will be referred to as one of the ancestors. you'll be referred to in in the story of the past. Uh, Either you're a hero or you transcend to the level of a man god, or maybe you're just one of the ancestors, someone that the present should listen to in terms of whatever you did in the past. So your actions in some way will echo throughout eternity, so to speak. Uh, and it is for that it will be imbued with meaning. Now, Zizek's notion of two deaths is that after you die, you will not just disappear from the face of the earth, because two deaths here means the natural death and the symbolic death. After you naturally die, your memory, your actions are still part of the social symbolic network. In a way, you are still very much relevant in the creation of meanings, in the creation of history, in the interpretation of reality. You are still being referred to. And we can see this one in history, especially when we talk about our heroes, former presidents, former remarkable individuals. They're dead, but we speak of them as if they're still alive. They're very, very much part of the social symbolic network. Not to mention, for example, Nietzsche's claim of God is dead. The idea is God somehow physically died by losing so much of people who have faith in him. But then what we have in the end is the symbolic God, the one that stays, the one that Nietzsche refers to as the shadow that just won't die. That is the symbolic part. That's kind of like how I imagine traditional man dying and then placed and transcending into the level of archetypes. Now you see how archetypes here is working as a kind of stable structure outside of our reality that is somehow making itself as the external guarantee of that reality itself. So that's how the archetypes work. And how about repetition? Repetition because when we do stuff in our material existence, we always base it on the prime event. We base our morality on a prime event. We base our the setup of our cities on the symbolic mountain. We interpret our lives based on, say, the mythical tree of life, etc. All that stuff. Most people who are influenced by the tradition of the paradise will always remember the paradise as some sort of mythical point of origin from which all that we are today are based on whatever happened in that paradise. The symbolism of the center, that's the archetype of the first fall, for example. And what happens is we get this material realm and this transcendental realm as the archetype. Now, the idea of regeneration of time in Eliade's book is that if you recall New Year festivals, and New Year resolutions, these are kind of, let's face it, there's really nothing new. It's just a continuation of time, really. But then we always imagine it as the ending of a cycle, the renewal of something, a renewal of a cause, a renewal of a vision of life. And what we actually have here is we subject time to our own cultural interpretation. Not in a sense that time exists outside of us and therefore kind of like puts pressure on our existence, making us do stuff within a timeline, whether or not it's progressing or whatever it is. Because what we have for Eliade, what we have with the notion of a modern man, of a historical man in relation to time, is that time somehow plays the role of a tyrant in us. We always are pressured with time, which reminds me of the saying, if you don't have the time, then how can you ever have time? This notion that time is objective, the time exists within a plane, a dimension of the Cartesian plane, for example. This idea that it works outside of us, that we don't control it, and therefore we are subject to it, and that forever we cannot escape it. What this notion of regeneration of time does is culture, our human culture itself, takes command of time as part of its structure. Cyclical time becomes a structure, as a social construct, which Eliade would say outside of this is the void. There's nothing outside. In a way, if historical man suffers existentially, so to speak, time, archaic man, traditional man, owns time. The eternal repetition of the cosmogonic act, by transforming every new year into the inauguration of an era, permits the return of the dead to life, and maintains the hope of the faithful in the resurrection of the body. This was Eliade trying to explain what precisely is the regeneration of time, and in the spirit of the eternal repetition. We simply grab time and then controls it, makes it serve for our purposes. Not as something external that we simply have to bow down to because we cannot escape it, but to, again, in the spirit of the archetypes, to transcend objective time itself and then make it subjective. Place it as something of our control, to play with it, to use it in the play of say, signifying chains, of the way we interpret the world. And because of that, we look at time as the process of going from one point to another point and returning back again in the spirit of regeneration. You don't really, the idea is that everything repeats in this eternal return of time. And time here is interpreted not as something external and objective outside of our mode of experience, but time as within that experience, interpreted by that experience, played with that experience, commanded by that experience. So it is transcended as an archetype of sort. It's not just part of the natural order of things, the natural world. It actually transcends. It's transcended into something that has regenerative power. And for Eliade, we still do that today when we speak of New Year resolutions. I mean, come on, there's really nothing into it. The fact that some people still consider it seriously, as if January will kind of like regenerate something and then changes everything to the way we view life. It does have this spirit of the regeneration of time. Now, one of the crucial part of cosmos and history is the idea of how do we deal with misfortunes in history. Because tragedies, disasters, cataclysms, apocalyptic events. How does archaic man or traditional man, or how did traditional man deal with misfortune in history? Let's deal with history later on. Now, there is something very, fatalistic about how this is actually being explained. Because Eliade, for example, would use karma as proof of how traditional man deals with misfortune. Kind of the normality of suffering. So it reminds you, for example, of the Buddhist first principle of life is suffering. When you suffer, it's normal anyway. And one of the powerful quotations that I read from the book was this, the second part here. The Messianic prophet's steadfast will to look history in the face and to accept it as a terrifying dialogue with Yahweh. The will to make military defeats bear moral and religious fruit and to tolerate them because they were regarded as necessary to Yahweh's reconciliation with the people of Israel, his final salvation. Now what this means is that traditional man simply looks at things that these are these are necessary things to happen in order to proceed through the cycle. Disasters had to happen. Apocalypse had to happen. The end of the world had to happen. Because this is the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. You cannot have rebirth without death. And because this is cyclical, misfortune is simply accepted as a fact of life. Again, this plays through the idea of transcending everyday event, although something cataclysmic is not an everyday event, but something that happens in our material world is being transcended towards part of a natural cycle of things. When I said, for example, that Eliade is using the idea of the regeneration of time to subject time to the cultural constructs of men, that too would be in effect when we look at misfortunes in history, disasters, so on and so on. Disasters are part of the cycle. They had to be there. In order for society or culture or civilization to be given a rebirth, it must first suffer death and cataclysms. And it gives comfort to traditional archaic man to look at these events, these misfortunes, as these are just normal. These had to happen. These are necessary in order for the cycle to continue. Apocalypse is not just the end. It's also a revelation of something that is to come. So you see in Apocalypse a kind of an end and at the same time a beginning, an alpha and an omega. The beginning and an end. But then the end itself is also the beginning. That the cycle moves on. So if we encounter suffering, if we encounter misfortune, all of that, natural stuff, they are necessary. In the case of Judaism, for example, these are necessary in our discourse with Yahweh. or the Hebrew. And again, I had to take a detour with Zizek here because in his book, Living in the End Times, what Zizek is also trying to offer is that if we are today living in the end times, we're not really, the end times here is not to be interpreted as like the end. But these are apocalyptic times in a sense that we need to figure out what to do next so that we can create something new after whatever cataclysm will happen. Zizek would always say to create this alienated space in order for us to view our history from a distance, to see it in its universal sense, to see the universal spirit, borrowing from Hegel, to see the universal spirit once more, to create that distance, that space, that gap in reality in order to proceed through the next stage of history. Zizek's model may not be the cyclical idea that Eliade is trying to say, but the idea is still very much the same. When we look at tragedies, disasters, like a collapsing economy, or right now, COVID, we should not look at these as the end of the world and therefore we need to panic and lose our nerves. What we do is look at these as opportunities for rebirth, opportunities for perhaps the reawakening of human rationality, etc. Zizek is still, as much of a pessimist that he still have an optimism of trying to give birth to something new in history. And for that, we need this kind of separation, this more alienation, as he would say. But this is precisely the kind of idea that Eliade is saying, albeit in a different standpoint. Because if Zizek sees misfortune as an opportunity to create something new, Eliade sees misfortune as the natural flow of the regeneration of time. For time to regenerate, there has to be something that needs to be regenerated. These are almost the same thing. I'm tempted to say that there's something Hegelian about Eliade. But how about modern man? How does modern man face this, what Eliade calls the terror of history? So there's a change here. It's not already misfortune in history. It's now the terror of history. Misfortunes are the unfortunate events that they have to happen in order for the regeneration, the cycle to proceed. The terror of history. The idea that whatever disaster can be hold meaningless. It's just plain terror itself. The disasters, misfortunes, cataclysms, apocalypse, these are terrors that history really has no answer of how does one deal with. For example, right now, how does one deal with COVID-19? This is a terror for sure. But the thing is, there's no history to tell us what to do. This is not part of a cycle. This is not part of an archetype. This is just plain terror. There's no transcending terror to a level in which it will become interpreted and accepted within the social symbolic network. None. It's very unlike archaic and traditional man. Traditional man would say, oh, the terror of history. This is part of the deal. In order for there is rebirth, in order for a rebirth to come, there must be death. We don't do that in history. in history is just plain terror. The death of so many Jews in the Second World War, of millions of people in the Second World War, or the disasters that humanity has to suffer in history. How do we deal with that? But then, Eliade somehow see hope, at least. He, for example, said that there is still the persistence of a cyclical time and an adherence to archetypes. Whenever people say, well, back then, you know what, blah, blah, blah. You know, back then, it used to be like this, like that. You know, in our time, there's something like this and like that. Etc., etc. This somehow almost performative way of looking at the past, of trying to emulate the past in order to change the present. There's still a sense of that. So it's not entirely bad news. And Eliade will use here Hegel and Marx, perhaps one of the most influential philosophers of history in Eliade's time, or even in our time. Hegel, for example, may look at history as the necessity, same as traditional man. Because Hegel was known for transforming contingency into necessity. So we see it in Hegel's repetition, this spiraling up, progressively spiraling historical change, historical development. And we see, for example, in Marx, this appeal towards ending history in a positive note. That there is some terror in history, and we ought to bring heaven on earth in order for the terror to end. So it's not simply history as having this autonomous meaning of subjective meaning, of whether we find meaning on it or not. This kind of historicism which makes the past only useful in relation to our existential being. So it's not necessarily bad news for that. Hegel is saying there are necessary sequences in history in order to bring about a stage. Marx is looking at the end of history in a sense of because the history of hitherto existing society, of the history is a history of class struggle. Then the end of history, or the end of the class struggle, would mean the end of history. Now, this is the reason why this book is almost anti-history. History is being played here in a very gruesome sense. The absence of meaning, the lost mindset of modern man, the existential crisis of meaning of the past. That's what history is all about. That's what modern man ended up having, this modern history. Historical man is a suffering man, but he does not understand what that suffering is. He is full of anxiety, but he does not understand what it is that makes him anxious. Eliade would say, if only you have the mindset to see the terror of history as a kind of a natural flow in the entire regeneration of time and the birth and rebirth of culture, societies, and civilization, then maybe perhaps you'll be comforted by the idea that all these things will just pass and we will enter into another stage. Now, the detour here that I will try to say would be Francis Fukuyama's End of History, because Fukuyama would suggest, in an attempt to somehow bring Nietzsche's The Last Man into history, the idea that history already ended with capitalism and liberal democracy, because there's nothing new. And here we see the cycle again, the persistence of the cycle. We are no longer in history, especially with capitalism and liberal democracy, because we are not progressing anymore. We already reach absolute spirit. That is still archetype. See you in the next video.